When I first moved into my new home, I felt like I had finally crossed a major milestone in life. After years of renting cramped apartments with thin walls, noisy neighbors, and landlords who seemed allergic to repairs, owning a standalone house with a yard of my own felt like a victory I'd worked toward for years. The property wasn't enormous, but it had a cozy charm that immediately appealed to me. A modest single-story house with brick trim, porch swing that creaked just right, in the evening breeze, and a stretch of grass that desperately needed mowing but looked full of potential. I was already planning a garden, maybe even some raised beds for vegetables. It was the kind of place where I could picture myself building a life, hosting barbecues, finally unpacking boxes I'd carted through, 4 different rentals without ever feeling like I had a permanent place to put them. It was a Saturday morning when the first hint of trouble arrived. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and I had just pulled on some gloves to tackle the unruly bushes by my driveway. I had my earbuds in, music playing, was actually enjoying the meditative rhythm of trimming branches and stacking them neatly by the curb. That was when I noticed a figure walking briskly down the sidewalk, zeroing in on me with the kind of determination that made my stomach tighten. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor coming over to introduce themselves. I straightened up, pulled out one earbud and smiled, ready to meet someone new. But instead of a friendly greeting, I was immediately hit with a rapid-fire barrage of questions. "Excuse me? Do you realize you're in violation already?" Voice sharp and practiced, like someone used to giving orders. She was in her mid-50s, with a perfectly styled bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and a pastel cardigan draped neatly over her shoulders, even though the day was too warm for it. Clutched in her hands was a thick clipboard, covered in papers, and sticky notes, as though she were prepared to catalog every perceived flaw within a 5-mile radius. I blinked, still trying to process who she was and what she was talking about. When she continued, "Your lawn hasn't been edged properly. Your hedges are overgrown, and I didn't see your HOA payment for this quarter. You're already behind, which means fines will apply." I frowned, caught off guard. "Sorry, what?" I asked, pulling off my gloves. "I think you might be mistaken. I'm not in an HOA." Her mouth fell open in exaggerated disbelief, as if I had just claimed the sky was green. "What do you mean? You're not in the HOA. Everyone in this community is. That's how it works." I shook my head. "No, actually, when I bought this house, one of the selling points was that it's outside the HOA boundaries. My realtor was very clear about that. This property was never included in the original charter." Her eyes narrowed behind the sunglasses, and she flipped through the papers on her clipboard like a prosecutor rifling through evidence before a trial. "That's impossible. Every house on this street is part of the association. We maintain standards for property values, and nobody gets a free pass." I could feel irritation rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Look, I've got the deed inside if you want to see it. It specifically states this property isn't governed by the HOA. I'm not trying to be difficult, but you really don't have jurisdiction here." Lips pressed into a thin line, and she gave a little huff of disbelief. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I'm the president of this HOA. I've been running this community for over a decade, and I know every single parcel of land here." "That's great," I said evenly, "but I'm still not in it. So whatever rules or fees you think apply to me, don't." She bristled, as though I had just committed an act of personal betrayal. For a moment, she simply stared at me, clutching her clipboard like a shield, before pointing one manicured finger at my yard. "We'll see about that. The HOA has rules, and rules are meant to be followed. If you think you can just waltz in here and lower our property values with unkempt grass, and what is that? A grill on the porch? Then you're sorely mistaken." I glanced at the old charcoal grill I'd hauled out of my garage, still dusty. "From the move, it's a grill," I said flatly. "And again, I'm not in your HOA, so whether you like it or not, it's none of your business." That was when I realized I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or an overzealous neighbor trying to welcome me with unsolicited advice. This was someone who thrived on control, who saw herself as the gatekeeper of the neighborhood's order, and who had just encountered someone outside her perceived chain of command. The look on her face was one of pure frustration, not Because she was right, but because I wasn't backing down, she tried one last tactic, her tone dripping with condescension. Young man, you may think you're clever, but rules are rules. If you refuse to cooperate, there will be consequences. You'll be hearing from us very soon. I met her glare with a calm smile. I look forward to it, I said, though my heart was beating faster than I let on. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back down the sidewalk, muttering something under her breath about people who think they're above the law. I stood there for a long moment, gloves dangling from one hand, wondering what exactly I had just gotten myself into. I'd been in the neighborhood less than a month, and already I had crossed paths with the self-proclaimed queen of the block. As I turned back to my yard work, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. I had deliberately bought a house outside an HOA because I wanted the freedom to plant tomatoes, paint my shutters whatever color I liked, and keep a grill on my porch without anyone policing me. Now it seemed fate had dropped me directly into the path of someone who embodied every horror story I'd ever heard about HOAs. Little did I know then that this encounter was just the opening move in a much bigger conflict, one that would escalate far beyond overgrown hedges and unpaid fees. For a few days after that first confrontation, I almost convinced myself the whole thing had blown over. The woman whom I'd privately dubbed HOA Karen, after hearing a few whispers from neighbors about her reputation, didn't make any more appearances on my lawn, and I figured maybe she'd finally realized her mistake. Week in peace, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and trying to make the house feel like home. But there was a strange undercurrent in the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors gave me sympathetic nods when I passed them on the street, as if they knew I'd been initiated into some unspoken feud. A few even muttered vague warnings. "Careful with her," one man said while walking his dog. "She doesn't let go of things." Another woman, leaning on her mailbox, whispered, "She's gotten the cops called on people before. Just keep your paperwork handy." Their words unsettled me, but I shrugged them off. Surely a person couldn't be that petty. Surely she had better things to do than chase after someone who wasn't even in her HOA. Then came the barbecue incident. It was a warm Thursday evening, and I had decided to break in the old grill with some burgers and hot dogs. The smoky scent drifted across the yard, and I had just cracked open a beer when I noticed a familiar figure lurking on the sidewalk across the street. There she was, clipboard in hand, glaring at me like I was committing a crime in broad daylight. I ignored her, flipped the burgers, and turned up the music on my phone. 10 minutes later, however, the sound of sirens cut through the evening air. I blinked in disbelief as a patrol car pulled up in front of my driveway. 2 officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, wearing that cautious but polite demeanor of people who weren't sure what they were walking into. "Evening, sir," one of them said as they approached. "We got a call about a disturbance. Something about refusing to comply with neighborhood regulations." I almost laughed, but instead I gestured to the grill and said, "You mean this? I'm making dinner?" The officers exchanged a look, then asked if they could speak with me privately. I led them to the porch. They explained that a woman had reported me for violating community bylaws and creating a nuisance. I rolled my eyes and went inside to grab the paperwork I had already learned to keep near the door. My deed, which clearly stated that my property was not, and never had been, under the jurisdiction of the HOA, I handed it over. The officers skimmed through it before nodding. "Yeah, this checks out," one of them said. "We'll let her." "No, this isn't a police matter." We walked back outside together, and sure enough, there was Karen, standing on the curb with her arms crossed, watching everything like a hawk. When the officers explained that I was within my rights and that this wasn't their jurisdiction, her face turned crimson. "He's lying," she snapped, her voice rising. "Every home is part of this community. You can't just opt out." One of the officers, clearly running low on patience, said, "Ma'am, he showed us legal documents. Unless you've got evidence to the contrary, there's nothing we can do here." Her jaw dropped and she sputtered like a kettle about to boil over. "So he just gets away with it. He lowers our standards and you just let him. Point of having rules if people can ignore them?" "That's a civil issue, not a criminal one," the officer replied firmly. "If you think you have a case, you'll need to take it to civil court. But please, don't call us for this again." The officers gave me a polite nod before returning to their car, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. I watched her stomp off down the street, muttering about calling the board and making this official. My hands shook a little as I picked up my spatula and returned to the grill. The adrenaline from dealing with the police hadn't worn off yet. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else. Anger, not just at her audacity to involve law enforcement over nothing, but at the realization that this was only the beginning. Sure enough, the harassment began in earnest after that night. A few days later, found a piece of paper taped to my front door, a notice of violation demanding I pay fines for failure to maintain yard standards and unauthorized outdoor cooking equipment. The letter was printed on cheap paper with the HOAS letterhead, signed in looping handwriting that I recognized as Karen's. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, but more followed. Every week, like clockwork, new violations appeared. Leaves in my gutter, trash can left too close to the curb, even unsanctioned decorative objects after I placed a small ceramic frog in my flower bed. It was laughable, but the constant barrage wore on me. Then came the letters in the mail. Somehow, she had gotten my address, which wasn't hard. Given that it was posted on my mailbox and began sending official-looking envelopes demanding payment. The tone grew nastier with each letter. First polite reminders, then warnings about fines doubling, then threats of legal action. I ignored them all, but each one left me more unsettled. I began to dread checking my mailbox, wondering what fresh nonsense awaited me inside. The neighbors noticed too. Some quietly distanced themselves, clearly unwilling to get on Karen's bad side, while others offered whispered words of encouragement. One man even told me, "You're not the first she's gone after, but you might be the first to stand up to her." That gave me some resolve, but it didn't change the fact that I felt like I was living under siege in my own home. The final straw came one rainy afternoon when I opened a certified letter that claimed the HOA had voted to place a lien on my property for unpaid dues. My hands trembled as I read the words, fury rising in my chest. A lien on my house? A property that was never even part of their HOA. That wasn't just harassment anymore. It was outright fraud. And in that moment, something in me snapped. I realized Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to wake up one morning and suddenly respect boundaries. If I wanted peace, I was going to have to fight back. I set the letter down, took a deep breath, and picked up my phone. It was time to call a lawyer. The morning after I received that fraudulent lien notice, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The paper lay spread out in front of me like some sort of dark omen, each official-looking phrase practically dripping with Karen's smug handwriting. I had spent half the night alternating between anger and disbelief. How could someone think they had the power to put a lien on a house they didn't even govern? I had bought this property precisely because it wasn't tied to the restrictions of an HOA. And now here I was, facing paperwork that threatened to jeopardize the very thing I had worked so hard to achieve. But under the anger was also clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a line being crossed. It was time to bring in someone who could actually fight back. I started calling lawyers that morning. The first two offices I reached out to seemed indifferent, brushing me off with, "It's probably nothing, just ignore it." But the third lawyer, a sharp-voiced woman named Patricia, immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. "She filed a lien without jurisdiction?" Patricia asked, her tone instantly shifting from casual to razor-sharp. "That's fraud. And if she's using the HOA's name to do it, that's misrepresentation. But don't worry, we'll handle this." Within days, Patricia had gathered the documents I gave her. The deed showing my house was exempt from the HOA, the stack of bogus violation notices, and the lien letter. She drafted a strongly worded response demanding the lien be withdrawn immediately, warning that failure to do so could lead to legal action. But Karen, true to form, didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down. A week later, another letter arrived, this one insisting that the HOA had confirmed my property was under their authority after a board review, and that the lien would proceed unless I paid not just dues, but accumulated fines. The audacity made my blood boil, but when I showed it to Patricia, She actually smirked. "This is good," she said, tapping the letter. "She just handed us evidence. If she's claiming to represent the HOA in matters outside their jurisdiction, then she's acting outside the scope of her authority. If she's funneling money through the HOA for this, that could be embezzlement. And if she's personally behind these threats, we might have grounds for damages." That was the first time I realized the balance of power was beginning to shift. Up until then, I had felt like a cornered animal, constantly reacting to Karen's attacks. But now, I had someone on my side who saw her behavior not just as harassment, but as a legal liability. It was like watching a chess game where I thought I was down to my last pawn, only for a hidden queen to appear on the board. Patricia filed an official complaint, and within weeks, a court summons was issued. Karen, it turned out, had a long history of skirting the line between overzealous enforcement and outright abuse of power. Previous neighbors had been too exhausted or intimidated to fight her, preferring instead to sell their homes or simply cave to her demands. But now, with the fraudulent lien attempt, she had crossed into territory where a judge could no longer ignore her antics. The first hearing was almost surreal. I sat in a quiet courtroom, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and disinfectant, while Karen strutted in as though she owned the place. She wore her best blazer and clutched her ever-present clipboard like a shield. When the judge asked her to present her case, she launched into a tirade about community standards and protecting property values. She insisted that my refusal to join the HOA was a threat to the neighborhood, and therefore she was justified in taking action. But then Patricia stood up. Calm, precise, and armed with a stack of documents, she dismantled Karen's argument, piece by piece. First, she presented the original HOA charter, which clearly defined its boundaries that excluded my property. Next, she presented my deed, which confirmed that exclusion. Finally, she highlighted the fraudulent lien notice and the follow-up letter where Karen claimed the board had reviewed and approved her actions. Patricia's voice didn't waver as she turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, this isn't just overreach, this is harassment, this is fraud. And it has caused my client measurable distress." The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. "Mrs. Robinson," he said slowly, addressing Karen, "can you explain why you attempted to file a lien against a property that is not, and never has been, under your association's jurisdiction?" Karen sputtered. For the first time, I saw cracks in her composure. She tried to argue that community spirit implied universal participation, that standards applied whether or not a deed said otherwise. But the judge wasn't buying. The law doesn't recognize spirit," he said curtly. "It recognizes contracts. And there is no contract here." That was the moment it truly hit me. She wasn't just overbearing, she was reckless. She had convinced herself that her imagined authority outweighed actual legal boundaries. And now it was catching up to her. In the weeks that followed, Patricia dug deeper into the HOA's finances, using the court process to demand records. What she uncovered was jaw-dropping. Karen had been mismanaging funds for years, using HOA money for personal expenses, luxury spa visits, new furniture, even a vacation she had disguised as a conference. Worse, she had been issuing fines to homeowners that weren't even valid under the HOA's charter, pocketing some of the proceeds herself. The fraudulent lien against me turned out to be just one piece of a much larger puzzle. By the time the evidence was compiled, Karen wasn't just facing my lawsuit. She was under investigation for embezzlement and misrepresentation. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out began to step forward, emboldened by the fact that someone was finally standing up to her. Stories poured out, threats of foreclosure over holiday decorations, intimidation tactics against elderly residents, fabricated fines for unauthorized gardening. It was like a dam had burst, and everything she had tried to keep hidden came flooding into the light. For me, the twist wasn't just discovering her corruption, it was realizing how many people she had bullied into silence. What had started as a personal battle over my right to grill burgers in my own yard had turned into something bigger, a reckoning for years of abuse. And as the case moved forward, it became clear that Karen wasn't just going to lose her fight with me, She was going to lose everything she thought made her untouchable. The day of the final hearing felt almost cinematic. The kind of moment you'd expect to see dramatized in a courtroom movie rather than lived out in real life. By then, months had passed since the first time Karen stormed onto my lawn with her clipboard, and what began as an annoying neighborhood spat had transformed into a full-blown legal battle with stakes far higher than I could have imagined. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the echo of footsteps bouncing off the marble floor as people shuffled into place. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia beside me, her demeanor calm but charged with quiet confidence. Across the aisle, Karen sat stiff-backed, her ever-present clipboard nowhere in sight for once, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. For the first time, she looked small, still radiating that self-righteous aura, but diminished, as if she'd finally realized the walls around her paper kingdom had started to crumble when the judge entered. After swearing us all in, he turned immediately to the matter at hand, the fraudulent lien, the harassment, and the financial misconduct uncovered during discovery. Patricia rose with practiced grace, presenting our case in a methodical, devastating rhythm. She laid out the timeline. Karen's repeated harassment, the bogus violation notices, the police call, the fraudulent lien filing, and finally, the financial records that painted a damning picture of her mismanagement of HOA funds. Each piece of evidence was projected onto the screen for the court to see, and with every new revelation, could feel the tide turning further in my favor. Karen's lawyer tried to spin the narrative, painting her as a dedicated community leader who had simply been misunderstood. He argued that her actions came from a desire to maintain order, not personal gain. But that defense crumbled the moment Patricia presented the receipts, literal receipts showing spa packages, airline tickets, and high-end furniture purchased with HOA funds. If these expenses were for community benefit, Patricia said, coolly, then perhaps the defendant can explain which bylaws justify weekly massages as a neighborhood necessity. The gallery chuckled, and even the judge raised an eyebrow at that. Karen's face went redder than I'd ever seen it. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head, but she didn't deny it. She couldn't. The evidence was irrefutable. Then, it was my turn to testify. I stood and recounted the entire ordeal. The initial encounter, the police being called, the endless violation notices, certified letters, the anxiety of checking my mailbox every day, the sleepless nights spent worrying about my home. I explained how I'd deliberately chosen a house outside of an HOA to avoid this exact kind of nightmare, only to be dragged into it against my will. My voice wavered at moments, but I forced myself to stay steady. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about holding her accountable for years of unchecked bullying. When I finished, the judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Mrs. Robinson," he said, turning to Karen, "I've reviewed the documents. I've heard the testimony, and I find it troubling. That you attempted to assert authority over a property that your association does not govern, more troubling. Still are the financial records, which suggest a pattern of misuse of HOA funds. Your position as president does not grant you immunity from the law." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, with the measured weight of a gavel about to fall, the judge issued his ruling. The fraudulent lien was declared null and void. Karen was ordered to pay damages for harassment and emotional distress, an amount that turned out to be 3 times the rent I had been paying in my last apartment. On top of that, an independent auditor was appointed to review the HOA's finances, and Karen was removed from her position as president effective immediately. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, the reign of HOA Karen was over. I walked out of the courtroom that day feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight of constant anxiety, the dread of opening my mailbox, the simmering anger at her audacity, all of it seemed to melt away as the courthouse doors swung open and fresh air hit my face. Patricia clapped me on the shoulder, congratulating me on standing my ground, and I thanked her with more gratitude than I could put into words. Without her, I might have caved, might have sold the house, and fled like so many others before me. But instead, I had fought and won. The aftermath in the neighborhood was almost as satisfying as the ruling itself. Word spread quickly, as it tends to in suburban communities, and suddenly I wasn't just the new guy. I was the one who had finally brought Karen down. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved from their driveways, some even stopping by to thank me quietly for doing what they hadn't been able to. One elderly couple confessed that Karen had once threatened to fine them for keeping a bird bath in their yard. Another family admitted they had been bullied over Christmas decorations. Now, with her gone, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. As for Karen, she all but disappeared from sight. I heard whispers that she had been forced to pay back thousands of dollars to the HOA, that she was facing additional investigations for her financial misconduct, and that her once iron grip on the community had been shattered. She no longer strutted around with her clipboard, no longer barked orders at neighbors, no longer acted like queen of the block. For the first time in years, people planted what they wanted in their gardens, parked cars in their own driveways, without fear of fines, and even grilled on their porches without a second thought. And me? I settled into my home with a newfound sense of peace. Every time I mowed my lawn, I did it with a smile, knowing I wasn't doing it to meet some arbitrary standard dictated by a self-appointed tyrant, but because I wanted my yard to look good for me. Every time I sat on my porch swing with a cold drink, I savored the freedom I had fought to protect. And yes, there was a special kind of irony in the fact that the very woman who had once threatened to ruin me was now, indirectly, helping pay for my mortgage through the damages she owed. In the end, the story wasn't just about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that part didn't feel sweet. It was about standing up to someone who had spent years abusing power unchecked. About proving that no one, no matter how loud, no matter how entitled, gets to trample over the rights of others without consequence. For me, the payoff wasn't just financial. It was the satisfaction of knowing I had faced down the HOA Karen, survived the storm, and come out the other side stronger, freer, prouder of the little house I now truly called my home.